Welcome to Mini Scandals, the series where we dive into the scandals, drama, and interesting stories that make up the world's hobbies, niches, and interests. Today, we're applying a base coat and trying not to mess up our highlights as we dry brush our way into the world of Warhammer. Warhammer Fantasy, and its somehow even edgier brother, Warhammer 40k, is the miniature wargame that somehow combines hypermasculine arts and crafts with enough dice to crush a small dog. A simple but brilliant concept that appeals to everyone from artists to tabletop gamers to the guy who's a little bit too infatuated with the German army from World War II for it to just be an interest in history. Warhammer is just as rife with scandals as the other hobbies that we've covered thus far. Unlike these other hobbies, however, it is not so much the players making the awful, misguided decisions that draw the ire from the community, but the game's producer, Games Workshop. After all, in the grim darkness of the far future, there are only short-sighted businessmen squeezing as much money as they can from a game they don't even play.
Speaking of, this video is brought to you by...
Hello, I'm White Morpheus. Welcome to the Construct Room, from the only NordVPN Matrix parody ad on YouTube. Imagine for a second that Roblox was banned in Guatemala. And imagine that you didn't have NordVPN to get around it. No problem, you might think. I don't live in Guatemala. The next thing you know, Football Manager 2005 is banned in China. You still don't have NordVPN. But I don't live in China, you might think to yourself. You think you're safe. You think, I don't need 5,200 of the fastest VPN servers in 60 different countries. That my country would never restrict access to my favorite games and TV shows. Next thing you know, Weed Mod for Minecraft is banned in Australia. You take the red pill and click the link in the description. You receive a risk-free 30-day money-back guarantee on a NordVPN subscription. You take the blue pill. Go to nordvpn.com/minikudos or click the link below to help support the channel and get a free month on a 2-year plan along with a special gift to celebrate their 10th birthday. Fanfiction, machinima, animations and cum tributes are always for creatively inclined fans to show their love and appreciation of their favourite hobbies, and their work invigorates the community and introduces countless more to these amazing worlds, all done for free out of sheer unrelenting passion. Games Workshop saw this and went fuck that, stapling an update of their IP guidelines to the foreheads of their passionate fanbase before rolling them down a flight of stairs. In July of 2021, nestled in between the reasonable request to not illegally distribute their books or sell counterfeit models, Games Workshop added in a wee little line demanding that individuals must not create fan films or animations based on our settings and characters. These are only to be created under license from Games Workshop. This line stands out in particular as this very same page gives guidelines for acceptable fan art and fan fiction that, while restrictive, still ultimately allow fans to create and share their work online. Why then would fan animations specifically be an issue?
So it's best to start off with the biggest news, and that is the newly announced Warhammer Plus. This is going to be a brand new service now coming from Games Workshop.
Not content to just sell you 30 cents of injection molded plastic for the price of a baby goat, Games Workshop observed their fans breaking their backs to make amazing content that advertises their game for free, and decided that stealing the very best ones to hide them behind a paywall is something that the community would love. Except that it isn't. Because why the fuck would anyone want that? The phenomenal fan film Astartes set a new standard amongst fan animations that looks like something cooked up by the sort of cinematic team that gets to unwind in the Cosby Suite, leading Games Workshop to scoop them up to create more content exclusively for Warhammer Plus, along with other talented artists and animators in the Warhammer community. While I'm all for these artists and studios receiving official funding to create more amazing projects, Games Workshop must surely realise that all of these artists created their work in an environment where they were freely allowed to upload fan animations online, and that by restricting them, they are not only depriving the community of more amazing free content, but future collaborators they could hire to create content for Warhammer Plus. In addition to hiring these artists to create new content, it appears they also brought the rights to the animations that made them famous in the first place, as these have all been taken off of YouTube. This zero tolerance policy, enacted by a company about as litigious as the Spicy Mouse Corporation, shook the Warhammer community to its core, with the many popular fan animation channels that weren't picked up by The Claw, now fearful for the future of their content.
One such series was If the Emperor Had a Text-to-Speech, the incredibly popular fan animation that eschews the regular grimdark war drama formula in order to make a goofy, fun comedy series set in the 40k universe.
The Warhammer TTS series has since gone on an indefinite hiatus, both out of fear of the legal action that could occur should they continue the series, and because of how just disheartening the announcement was to its creator.
I do not know how far they are willing to go to protect their IP, especially with an incentive to monopolize 40k content through a streaming service, and I do not want to find out.
For creators like TTS, this was a direct attack on their livelihood, and while you might argue that they were making this off the back of another company's IP, in my opinion it's no different to all of the channels that make a living giving painting advice or explaining lore or ways to eat the models, or the hundreds of other ways that people enjoy this hobby.
Unsurprisingly, TTS has continued creating content, but for a different game and company that respects their creative community and the symbiotic relationship they provide.
The community was justly outraged about this decision, pointing to shows like TTS as their entry point to the series as a whole, as well as decrying Games Workshop for locking all of this content behind yet another streaming service to add to the pile of streaming services that undermine the entire reason we even subscribed to streaming services in the first place. The popular 40k meme subreddit r/grimdank locked itself in protest, the Reddit equivalent of a hunger strike, while other subreddits, Twitter threads, and forum posts were overrun by fans furious about this decision, which undid a lot of the goodwill that Games Workshop had earned over the last few years.
It has been 6 months since Warhammer Plus has launched, and despite the massive fan outcry, Games Workshop has not repealed their zero tolerance policy on fan animations.
According to their half-yearly investor report, the shows on Warhammer Plus have accrued an impressive 2 million views across every show over 3 months.
You know, the sort of numbers that a single episode of TTS gets on YouTube.
Hope it was worth it. Political discourse being what it is right now, this one's gonna be fun. Oh, how I wish we could return to a time when telling neo-Nazis to fuck off was an uncontroversial statement. To clarify, this doesn't deal with the brainworm-infested take of anyone more right-leaning than me as a Nazi. This deals with an actual, genuine neo-Nazi, who, as mentioned earlier, can fuck off.
Warhammer 40k is a setting where if you ask who the good guys are, you'll be answered with yes. Everyone is at varying levels on the cunt metric, but notably they're all on there, including the Imperium of Man.
Humanity in the far future are portrayed as xenophobic, power-hungry tyrants and paranoid religious zealots, which can seem appealing to people who were repeatedly dropped on their head as a baby.
In November of 2021, the large unofficial GT Talavera tournament held in Spain found itself infested by one such individual who rocked up to the event wearing neo-Nazi imagery, including a swastika made of swastikas,
aka the worst maze. The player used the pseudonym Austrian Painter, which I imagine took 4 of them 3 full shifts to come up with, and the man quickly found that nobody wanted to play with him, a lesson I figured he would have learned back in kindergarten.
One of the opponents who refused to play against him demanded that he be expelled from the tournament, but according to the organisers, they were legally barred from doing anything.
Obviously versed in the ways that he could spread his ideology while keeping the majority of his teeth inside his mouth, the provocateur stated that he wasn't causing any problems and would happily play against anyone in the tournament, but if they tried to remove him, he would call the police.
Conveniently for him, Nazi symbolism is not illegal to show in Spain, and even more bizarrely, removing him solely on the basis that he was a neo-Nazi would be considered ideological discrimination, and the smug little asshole may well have a case against them if they attempted it.
It was for these reasons that the tournament organisers said that they were unfortunately forced to give the win to the man who worshipped the goose-stepping gunsucker, as his opponents refusing to play against him effectively counted as a forfeit. Despite being given this free win, the man with a consolation prize for a brain didn't place anywhere notable in the tournament.
While this wasn't an official Games Workshop tournament, it still managed to cause enough of a stir for Games Workshop to make an official statement that doesn't specifically mention the spicy Spaniard, but is still clearly in response to the event.
Their statement points out that the setting of 40k is satirical, not aspirational, something you would think almost anyone taking a cursory glance at the game would recognise.
They even state that if you show up to a Games Workshop event wearing symbols of real-life hate groups, you will be barred from participating and that they don't want your money.
You know you're a part of some sick shit when even Games Workshop doesn't want your money. Some fans saw this post as virtue signalling from Games Workshop, decrying that the hobby maker had gone woke, which by that logic means the Allies were also woke kings when they bullied Hitler into painting his final piece using chunks of his brain matter. Still, the vast majority of the community seemed in favour of Games Workshop's statement, outside of some no doubt very productive discussion around whether the Imperium of Man are good or not. While it might have been illegal to expel him on ideological grounds, the GT Talavera organisers said in their statement that they are working to write legal tools into the terms of the tournament that would allow them to legally expel people promoting hate groups at their events, preferably with the use of a catapult.
This story is going to be a bit of a soft spot for some people, possibly even more than the idea of neo-Nazis invading your hobby, the same way a venereal disease invades your crotch. I am of course talking about the end times, or how Games Workshop took 30 years of plot, backstories and beloved characters and slowly fed them all into a blender in the hopes that the spectacle of it all might make money fall from your wallet. Warhammer Fantasy was Games Workshop's original IP, Do Not Steal, made to utilise the models they were previously making for use in role-playing games such as Dungeons & Dragons, another hobby that we've found is rife with many scandals. The first Warhammer Fantasy rulebook was released in 1983, and the combination of rulebooks and miniatures quickly put them on the wargaming map. 4 years later, in 1987, a spin-off rulebook named Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader was released, which allowed you to use your fantasy miniatures in a lightweight, skirmish-based science fiction setting, later referred to as just Warhammer 40k, named after the average amount of money that a Warhammer player will spend on the hobby each year. Warhammer Fantasy was a game of investment, with players pouring exceptional amounts of time and money into the factions they resonated with, either because they were fun to play, had a cool backstory, or were just neat to look at. This is all well and good if you played one of the more popular factions, as you would receive regularly updated rulebooks that provided significant upgrades for your army, assuming you bought the corresponding new models as well, of course. The less popular factions, meanwhile, were forced to suck shit for years or in some cases even a decade, such as the poor Bretonians, whose last update was in 2004. In the early 2010s, after 30 years of existence, interest in Warhammer Fantasy was waning. While this could partially be attributed to the high barrier of entry that turned away new players and restricted old players from experimenting with new armies, Games Workshop was also unwilling to consistently update the game, instead choosing to focus on 40k. Recognizing that this barrier to entry was halting the game's growth, Games Workshop set out to do the unthinkable. No, not update the game's rules to make them more accessible or lower their prices, are you mad? In a moment of orcish genius, they instead opted to smash everything into little bits, and then keep smashing them until they formed a fine spreadable paste. In 2014, Games Workshop began releasing a series of 5 books named The End Times, which included updated rules for brand new models, as well as the first real progression the game's overarching plot has ever really seen. There's a lot going on in each of these books, as they're essentially chronicling what each faction is doing in the lead up to the end of the world, with its lore page on the wiki so long that scrolling barely makes the scroll bar tick down. Some players were excited about finally receiving major plot updates, while other people felt that the characters and factions they had grown to love were either acting out of character or just flat out ignored.
Also, the Skaven blow up the moon. The final book drops and chaos wins. Warhammer's always had a dark tone, but having your entire fantasy world turn to ash as it's enveloped with darkness is probably about as dark as you can get. Literally. The world wasn't the only thing left in the dark, as fans were left wondering where things would go from here, and if the armies they spent hundreds or even thousands of dollars on would still be usable. Thankfully, they didn't have to wait long to find out, although the answer might not have been quite what they were looking for.
July 2015, just 4 months after the end of Warhammer Fantasy, saw the release of Warhammer Age of Sigmar, or Sigmar. A hip, sexy, new millennial version of Warhammer Fantasy, with none of those boring rules for nerds.
After all, this isn't your dad's fantasy war game.
The rules book went from the 300-page long Warhammer Fantasy brick that you could use to kill most rodents to a rulebook shorter than a Chinese takeaway menu that would leave most rodents unscathed and laughing at your ineffective bludgeon.
Of course, rulebooks aren't marked on their ability to cause bodily harm, although that may have been the one thing that the early Age of Sigmar rules could be used for. While removing the extensive army composition and regimenting in favour of 40k skirmish style combat definitely streamlined things, many of these features were the reason that people had come to love the game in the first place. On top of it all, some dribbling toothlicker in management decided that Age of Sigmar should play like a drunken game of Jackbox, where the only jokes anyone knows are bad Monty Python parodies, and added in a variety of wacky rules that appealed exclusively to band kids with no inside voice.
These included letting out a primal war cry to add 1 to all hit rolls made for your war gore standard bearer, or holding a goblet aloft and shouting "for the lady" to re-roll failed hit rolls on your Grail Knights, or the ability to re-roll any failed hit rolls as long as your moustache is bigger and more impressive than your opponent's.
A rule that would unfairly penalise any woman playing, if any woman actually played Warhammer. Age of Sigmar was also released without any point system, which assigns units point values based on their power level in order to balance games for competitive play.
These changes were partly due to management's desire to make the game less about, well, the game, and more about the collecting and modelling side of things.
That is assuming your favourite factions even still existed to be collected, as many of the less popular factions were dropped harder than campaign promises after election day, leaving many players with nothing but pleasant memories and unusable armies.
This came as a spit in the face to the players who had enjoyed the old gameplay style of fantasy, who were also reeling from the fact that their beloved, detailed, and famously not silly world had just been flushed down the toilet and replaced with an even less funny game of Cards Against Humanity.
Perhaps still bitter about not being able to trademark the name Space Marine, Games Workshop took this opportunity to rename many of their fantasy races to ones that are decidedly easier to trademark. Dwarves became Duradin, Elves became Elves, and Games Workshop's legal team became richer by the day. To say that Warhammer fans were outraged would be an understatement, with entire regiments of them flanking the information superhighway to announce their disgust in civil, respectful ways.
And setting their armies on fire in protest. The trailer for the new setting also has its likes and dislikes disabled,
aka the Coward's Gamble. Huge swaths of players boycotted the game, sold off their old armies, or moved on to a different war game entirely, and some Skaven players attempted to blow up the moon in real life out of protest. To add insult to injury, a string of some of the best Warhammer video games we've ever seen released after Age of Sigmar that was still set in the old fantasy world, that I'll remind you was no longer being supported on the tabletop.
The irony of it all is that beneath all the silly gag rules and paper-thin lore, the gameplay actually had some solid potential, doing away with a lot of the unnecessary complexity that bogged down traditional fantasy games. After the game's release, a large management shakeup occurred at Games Workshop, with the old guard leaving and being replaced with people making decisions that swung Age of Sigmar's direction back towards that of a playable game, reintroducing point values, hacking out the silly rules like a goofy tumour, and finally fleshing out the lore.
These days, Age of Sigmar has won over a lot of the people who originally boycotted,
giving out consistent updates and tweaks that not only steadily improve the game, but significantly outpace the sloth-like release schedule that had become so detrimental to Warhammer Fantasy. Still, it appears that the aggressive oscillations of Fantasy's fans didn't go unnoticed, as Games Workshop has announced that they will one day bring back the classic style of fantasy gameplay. We can only hope that for this guy's sake, Games Workshop will allow heaping chunks of melted plastic in their tournaments. Hungry for more mini scandals? Why not choose between Dungeons & Dragons scandals or World of Warcraft scandals? This video only managed to cover 3 of the many dramas in Warhammer. What would you like to see in a part 2?